The Weddell Sea lies along the eastern edge of Antarctica, a wide expanse of cold water bordered by one of the most remote coastlines on Earth. For much of the year, its surface is covered by thick pack ice that drifts slowly with ocean currents and wind. In the early 20th century, this region remained largely unmapped. Few ships had ventured deep into its frozen interior, and fewer still had returned with reliable charts. During the austral summer of 1914, the sea appeared calm. Large flat fields of ice stretched to the horizon, broken occasionally by pressure ridges where sheets had collided and risen into low walls. The air was clear but cold, and the sun remained above the horizon for long hours each day. Beneath the surface, powerful currents moved steadily westward, carrying ice along with them. Wildlife moved through this environment with ease. Seals rested on the ice edges. Penguins gathered in groups near open leads of water. Whales surfaced in the distance, their breath rising briefly before vanishing into the cold air. There were no permanent human settlements in this part of Antarctica. Any ship that entered these waters was entirely dependent on its own supplies, its crew, and the stability of the ice. Communication with the outside world was impossible. Once a vessel passed into the pack, it was effectively isolated for months. It was into this quiet, shifting landscape that a wooden ship named Endurance sailed in January 1915, carrying a group of men intent on crossing the Antarctic continent from sea to sea. The voyage of Endurance was part of an ambitious plan known as the Imperial Trans-Antarctic Expedition. Its leader, Sir Ernest Shackleton, had already traveled to Antarctica on earlier expeditions. In 1909, he had come within 97 miles of the South Pole before turning back. By 1914, he aimed to achieve what no one had yet completed, a crossing of the entire Antarctic continent. The expedition was divided into two groups. Shackleton would lead the main party aboard Endurance, landing on the Weddell Sea coast and beginning the long march across the ice. A second ship, Aurora, would approach from the opposite side of the continent through the Ross Sea, laying supply depots along the planned route. The crew of Endurance consisted of 28 men. They came from different backgrounds and countries, including Britain, Ireland, Australia, and New Zealand. Some were experienced sailors, others scientists, and several were recruited for their physical strength and endurance rather than formal training. Among them was Frank Wild, Shackleton's second-in-command, who had accompanied him on earlier Antarctic journeys. There was Tom Crean, an Irish seaman known for his reliability in extreme conditions. Lionel Greenstreet served as the ship's first officer, responsible for navigation. Frank Hurley was the expedition photographer, tasked with documenting the journey using heavy glassplate cameras. The ship itself had been built in Norway in 1912 for polar work. Its wooden hull was reinforced to withstand pressure from ice, designed to be lifted upward rather than crushed when squeezed by floes. Shackleton believed Endurance was strong enough to survive the harsh Antarctic environment. Supplies filled every available space. The crew carried food for more than a year, including tinned meat, biscuits, sugar, and dried vegetables. There were dogs for pulling sledges, coal for heating, medical equipment, and scientific instruments. Everything necessary for life in isolation had been carefully loaded. When Endurance left South Georgia Island in December 1914, the men expected a difficult voyage but believed they would reach the Antarctic coast within weeks. None anticipated that the ship would never touch land again. In January 1915, Endurance pushed deeper into the Weddell Sea, weaving slowly through floating ice. At first, progress was steady. Open stretches of water appeared between floes, allowing the ship to advance southward. As days passed, the ice grew thicker and more closely packed. By mid-January, the temperature dropped further, and the sea began freezing faster than it could break apart. Large fields of ice closed around the hull. The crew used poles and ice anchors to push away floes when possible, but the movement of the pack was controlled by wind and current, not by human effort. On January 18, the ship became fully trapped. The surrounding ice locked into place, holding Endurance in a frozen grip. There was no clear channel of water ahead or behind. Shackleton ordered the engines stopped to conserve fuel. From that point onward, the ship drifted wherever the ice carried it. Weeks passed as the frozen sea slowly transported the vessel northward, away from the Antarctic continent. The men adapted to life aboard a motionless ship. They hunted seals and penguins to supplement their rations. Routine was maintained to preserve discipline and morale. As winter approached, darkness increased. By May, the sun no longer rose above the horizon. Temperatures dropped well below freezing. The ice surrounding the ship thickened, expanding and contracting with pressure. In October 1915, the pack ice began to shift more violently. Large floes collided under the influence of storms far out at sea. Pressure ridges formed near the ship, towering above the deck. The wooden hull groaned as ice pressed inward. On October 24, the beams inside Endurance began to bend. Water seeped through seams in the hull. Pumps were activated, but the flow increased steadily. By late October, it became clear that the ship could not survive. The pressure from the ice was too great. Shackleton gave the order to abandon ship. Supplies, boats, and equipment were hauled onto the ice beside the sinking vessel. On November 21, 1915, after weeks of crushing pressure, Endurance finally broke apart. The hull twisted, the stern rose briefly, and then the ship slipped beneath the ice. What remained was a wide stretch of frozen sea and 28 men standing beside their scattered supplies. They were now alone on the drifting pack ice, more than 1,000 miles from the nearest settlement. After the loss of Endurance, Shackleton ordered the men to establish a camp on a large, relatively stable floe. Tents were pitched using canvas salvaged from the ship. The 3 lifeboats, James Caird, Dudley Docker, and Stancomb Wills, were placed upside down on the ice to serve as additional shelter. The first camp was named Ocean Camp. Its position changed constantly as the floe drifted north with the currents of the Weddell Sea. The men marked their approximate location using sextant readings when weather allowed, but exact navigation was difficult in the shifting ice. Daily life settled into a strict routine. Each man was assigned tasks. Some were responsible for cooking, others for hunting, maintaining equipment, or caring for the dogs. Meals were prepared on small stoves fueled by seal blubber. Fresh meat became essential not only for nutrition but also to conserve the limited tinned food supplies. Seal hunts occurred whenever animals appeared near open water leads. Penguins were also taken when available. The meat was eaten fresh or frozen for later use. The blubber was stored for fuel. Nothing was wasted. The men slept in cramped conditions, often several to a tent. Condensation formed on the canvas and froze, creating layers of ice overhead. Temperatures regularly dropped far below zero. Wind swept across the open ice, carrying fine snow that penetrated clothing and bedding. Despite the harsh conditions, Shackleton maintained a structured schedule. Breakfast was served at regular hours. Work periods were clearly defined. Evenings included simple games, readings, or discussions to occupy the long hours of darkness. Morale was carefully guarded. Shackleton moved frequently among the tents, speaking with each man individually. He ensured that food portions were equal, regardless of rank. Any signs of conflict or despair were quietly addressed. By December 1915, cracks began forming in the ice near Ocean Camp. Some leads of water widened rapidly, threatening to split the floe apart. Recognizing the danger, Shackleton ordered the camp dismantled. The men hauled their boats and supplies across the uneven ice to a thicker floe farther north. This new settlement became known as Patience Camp. The move required days of exhausting labor. Heavy loads were dragged over pressure ridges and across soft snow. At Patience Camp, the waiting resumed. The ice continued to drift slowly toward open water. Some days passed quietly, with little change in surroundings. Other days brought violent movement as floes collided. The dogs, once intended for sledging across the continent, were gradually lost as food supplies became strained. Some fell through thin ice. Others were shot to conserve resources. Their loss marked the end of the original expedition's goals. Health issues emerged. Frostbite affected fingers and toes. Damp clothing led to sores and infections. Yet no man was seriously incapacitated. Weeks turned into months. The men lived in a world of shifting ice, low temps, and constant cold. They remained dependent on hunting and rationing to survive. By early April 1916, the floe began breaking apart more rapidly. Large cracks widened into open water channels. It became clear that the ice would soon no longer support the camp. Shackleton gave the order to prepare the boats for launch. Their time on the floating ice was coming to an end. On April 9, 1916, the remaining ice beneath Patience Camp fractured into smaller sections. Water surged up through widening gaps. Shackleton ordered the men into the 3 lifeboats, each heavily loaded with supplies and equipment. The sea was filled with loose ice chunks, making progress slow and dangerous. The boats were forced to weave through narrow channels and occasionally be hauled over ice floes when the water closed ahead. Cold waves broke over the sides, soaking clothing and bedding almost immediately. The men rotated rowing duties in short shifts to prevent exhaustion. Sleep was limited to brief periods whenever conditions allowed. Meals consisted mainly of cold seal meat and biscuits. For 7 days, the small flotilla drifted and struggled northward through the broken pack. Winds often pushed them backward, undoing hours of effort. At times, fog reduced visibility to a few yards. On April 15, land finally appeared on the horizon. It was Elephant Island, a remote, mountainous outcrop off the Antarctic peninsula. None of the men had originally planned to reach it, but it offered the first solid ground they had seen in nearly 500 days. Landing was difficult. Heavy surf crashed against the rocky shore. The boats were driven toward the beach during brief lulls between waves. Several nearly capsized, but all reached shore intact. The men collapsed onto the narrow strip of land, exhausted and soaked. Elephant Island was bleak and uninhabited, with steep cliffs rising sharply from the coast. Snow covered much of the ground. There was little shelter from wind or cold. Supplies were carried ashore and organized. The boats were pulled above the high water line. One was turned upside down and propped up with rocks to create a crude shelter. Although they had reached land, their situation remained dire. Elephant Island lay far from any shipping routes. No rescue would come unless someone went for help. Shackleton quickly assessed their position. Of the 3 boats, the James Caird was the largest and strongest. He decided it would be modified for a long open sea journey to South Georgia Island, over 800 miles away. 6 men were chosen for the voyage: Shackleton himself, Frank Worsley as navigator, Tom Crean, John Vincent, Timothy McCarthy, and Harry McNish, the ship's carpenter. McNish reinforced the boat with wood and canvas, raising the sides and sealing gaps with seal blood and flour to improve waterproofing. A small deck was constructed to provide some protection from waves. On April 24, 1916, the James Caird was launched into the Southern Ocean. The remaining 22 men stayed behind on Elephant Island under the leadership of Frank Wild. As the small boat disappeared into the distance, those on shore returned to their shelter, uncertain if they would ever see their companions again. The James Caird entered one of the most dangerous stretches of ocean in the world. The Southern Ocean was known for powerful storms, freezing temperatures, and massive waves. The boat measured just over 22 feet in length, heavily loaded and riding low in the water. Worsley relied on brief glimpses of the sun through cloud cover to take navigational readings with a sextant. Even a small error could send them far off course, missing South Georgia Island entirely and drifting into open ocean. For 16 days, the men endured constant exposure. Waves frequently washed over the deck, filling the boat with icy water that had to be bailed out by hand. Frost formed on clothing and equipment. The sleeping bags remained wet throughout the journey. Food was rationed carefully. Each man received small portions of biscuits, dried milk, and melted ice for drinking water. Hot meals were rare, prepared only when conditions allowed the small stove to be lit safely. Several storms batterdiving with gale-force winds battered the boat. At times, the men were forced to lie still while waves passed beneath them, the boat rising steeply and crashing down again. The canvas deck provided limited protection. John Vincent and Harry McNish became increasingly weak from exposure. Crean and McCarthy took on longer rowing shifts to compensate. Shackleton remained alert, ensuring that no one was allowed to give up. On May 8, 1916, after more than 2 weeks at sea, the dark outline of South Georgia Island appeared through the mist. The boat had reached its target with remarkable accuracy. The western coast of the island was rugged and uninhabited, lined with steep cliffs and glaciers. With little strength left, the men navigated into a small cove and brought the boat ashore. They were now on land again, but far from help. The whaling stations, where rescue could be arranged, were located on the opposite side of the island. After resting briefly, Shackleton selected Worsley and Crean to accompany him on a crossing of the island's interior. No complete crossing had ever been attempted before. On May 19, 1916, the 3 men began their march across mountains and glaciers with minimal equipment. They traveled continuously for nearly 36 hours, climbing steep slopes, sliding down snow-covered ridges, and navigating through fog. They finally descended into Stromness, one of the whaling stations, where workers were stunned by their appearance. Shackleton immediately began organizing a rescue mission for the men left on Elephant Island. Multiple attempts to reach the island were blocked by sea ice. Ships were turned back repeatedly over the following months. Finally, on August 30, 1916, a small Chilean vessel named Yelcho managed to break through the ice and reach Elephant Island. Frank Wild and the remaining men saw the ship emerge through the fog. Shackleton was aboard. All 22 men were brought safely off the island. The rescue of the men on Elephant Island marked the end of the Imperial Trans-Antarctic Expedition's struggle for survival. Nearly 2 years had passed since Endurance first entered the Weddell Sea. Throughout that time, not a single life had been lost among Shackleton's crew. Once aboard the Yelcho, the men were taken to Punta Arenas in Chile, where they received medical attention and proper food for the first time in many months. Most suffered from frostbite, weight loss, and exhaustion, but all recovered. The wider world was still consumed by the First World War. News of the expedition's survival received attention, but it was soon overshadowed by events in Europe. Many of the men would go on to serve in the war in various capacities. Shackleton later reflected on the expedition not as a failure of exploration, but as a demonstration of leadership and endurance under extreme conditions. Though the original goal of crossing Antarctica had never been achieved, the survival of every crew member became its lasting legacy. Photographs taken by Frank Hulley preserved images of the ship trapped in ice, the camps on drifting floes, and the small boats battling through frozen seas. These records offered rare insight into life in one of the most hostile environments on Earth. The story of the Endurance expedition remained an important example in polar history. It showed the limits of human planning in the face of nature, and the necessity of adaptability when conditions changed beyond control. The men who lived on the drifting ice for months did not conquer Antarctica. Instead, they endured it. Their survival depended not on technology or strength alone, but on discipline, cooperation, and steady leadership in a place where rescue was never certain. When the ice finally released them, it left behind a silent sea and the remains of a ship resting beneath frozen water, a reminder of how quickly the environment could erase human presence. The Weddell Sea returned to its quiet, shifting state, as it had long before the Endurance arrived.